Sharper Than a Serpent's Tooth. Written by the Hanged Man 317 and read by Purple Star. Chapter 21.
How long have I been out?
You've been drifting in and out for the past few days, but this is the first time you've been conscious enough to talk.
Shouta huffed, resisting the urge to pick at his bandages, if only because he knew Hizashi would scold him for it.
And when will I be discharged?
Ah. It looked like he wasn't going to avoid that scolding after all. Shouta cut him off hastily.
It's a logical question.
This isn't a training accident. You were really hurt.
All the more reason to get a timetable for my recovery.
Shouta!
I have a job. 2 of them, actually. What? Would you trust All Might to teach your homeroom class?
I thought you were going to die, Hizashi whispered, hands balled up in the blanket he was sitting on, and eyes fixed in the blank wall in front of him, refusing to look down at Shouta where he lay.
I didn't,
said Shouta, with a faltering conviction. The memory of shattered bones twisted through his arm, and when he closed his eyes, all he could see was the dead-eyed Nomu looming over him, the skin at his elbow flaking away to nothing, vision filling with crimson as he desperately tried to keep his gaze on Shigaraki, to keep him from harming one of his students. The crushing dread of his failure that sent him hurtling into unconsciousness.
I'm still alive, so there's nothing to worry about. I'll be fine.
But you weren't fine!
Hizashi's voice began to tremble, a telltale sign of his quirk about to jump free, and Shouta instinctively prepared himself to erase it, before slamming the impulse down. As if he could tell, Hizashi reined in his voice on his own, with a few shuddering breaths.
It was bad. I never want to see that again.
We're heroes. It's an occupational hazard.
Immediately, he knew it was the wrong thing to say. His eyes darting to the side to avoid Hizashi's pained glare.
That's not what I want to hear, and you know it. I know I can't make you promise it won't happen again.
Shouta bristled as much as the bandages would allow.
My students were in danger. I had to.
I get it, Sho. I really do. I know we have dangerous jobs, and I know that it wasn't your fault. I'm really proud of you for doing that. I'm angry as hell, but proud. And I know you'd do it again in a heartbeat, and I can't blame you for that. I knew what I was getting into, but...
Hizashi sighed, running a hand through his hair and pulling more errant strands from the already loose bun.
That doesn't mean you can't take care of yourself.
I have to.
I know you're a workaholic. I have 3 jobs, Sho. I know what it's like to be stuck doing nothing, feeling like you're gonna explode if you don't get something done right now, immediately, this second.
Another sigh, and Hizashi looked down at him with a watery smile.
They said a couple weeks. With Chio's help, they can shave it down to 1. But if you want to do that, then you have to rest, okay?
Shouta huffed, moving to turn onto his side, before a sharp twinge of pain in his ribs reminded him why that was a bad idea. Groaning, Hizashi placed his head in his hands.
I'm serious, Sho. You know how her quirk works. I know you're not an idiot. Even if you insist on acting like one sometimes, he said, not quite muttering the last part under his breath.
Shouta began to roll his eyes and remembered why he shouldn't do that either. It was stifling, sitting still and letting the world move on without him, especially when he knew that the villains who had hurt his students were still out there. No doubt plotting their next move. Already he was running through plans in his head, horrified by the idea that his students might face another foe without the proper training, that he might fail them again. Still, Hizashi was right. If he was really to undergo any sort of sustained healing from Chiyo, he needed to conserve his strength. And besides, hearing Hizashi's voice break like that, seeing the devastation in his eyes, he didn't want that.
Fine.
Really? Just like that?
Shouta huffed again, wishing he could cross his arms.
You made a pretty solid argument. It makes sense for me to take it easy.
Great!
Hizashi clapped his hands together excitedly.
So you'll take a few days of school?
What if they aren't ready? I never said that.
Show!
Look, they're probably taking a couple days off from school anyway, right? Nezu has to deal with all the media fallout. The kids need time to recover.
And you should take a few extra days on top of that. You know, it might surprise you to hear, but those kids aren't stuck in the hospital after hours of extensive surgery.
Yes, but seeing me could bring them a sense of normalcy.
Not when you're a walking corpse!
Hizashi stood from the bed, frustration making itself known in the way he paced across the room.
They understand what happened. They'll know you just need some time to recover. They're high schoolers, not idiots.
What's the difference? Grumbled Shouta. Hizashi reared back with what was no doubt a sharp retort, but a polite knock at the door interrupted him mid-breath. The heroes looked at each other, then at the door. For a brief, ridiculous moment, Shouta began to map out all the possible exits and entryways in this room, as well as any potential weapons. The knock came again, this time accompanied by a voice.
Hello? It's Detective Takeuchi. Can I come in?
Relaxing muscles Shouta hadn't even known were tense, he watched Hizashi collapse into one of the bedside chairs and shoot him a sharp look.
This conversation isn't over,
he whispered, eyes narrowing when Shouta just snorted. He called out towards the door.
Come on in.
Takeuchi looked a little worse for wear as he entered the room. Rough stubble along his jaw and dark circles under his eyes as he took off his rumpled coat and set it on a chair, sinking into it with a heavy sigh.
I take it you've been working?
Asked Shouta. Takeuchi looked up, barely repressing a huff of laughter before pinching the bridge of his nose.
Yeah. Been a long couple nights. You look ridiculous, by the way.
You try getting smashed into the ground repeatedly, and see if you look any better.
I think I'll pass, thanks.
The detective pulled out his notebook, flipping through the pages pensively.
I came to talk to you, actually.
I already gave you my statement. Was there something wrong with it?
No, it's not that. Your statement was very thorough, as always. It's not even about the USJ, actually. It's just...
Takeuchi closed the notebook with a sharp snap, placing it in his lap to rub at his temples.
It's just something that's been nagging at me.
Shouta shifted as much as his injuries would allow. His interest piqued. Takeuchi wasn't one to come to him with inane theories or superstitions. If something was bothering him, it probably had merit.
One of your students,
the detective continued with another weary sigh.
Suzuki Era.
Both Shouta and Hizashi stiffened, and Takeuchi looked up with a wry expression. I see you're familiar.
Well, she was at the USJ,
said Hizashi hastily.
And she's in my homeroom. If I weren't familiar by now, I'd be a pretty poor teacher.
Right. Takeuchi sounded doubtful, but continued regardless. Well, I was taking her statement after she woke up.
She was unconscious?
Asked Shouta, shooting Hizashi an incredulous look.
You said all of the students were fine.
They are. She just...
Suzuki-era passed out from what appeared to be blood loss and some form of quirk exhaustion, but she's made a full recovery. Tsukauchi tapped a pen against his notebook impatiently.
That's beside the point. As you know, typically, before starting an interview, I ask a baseline question to set the tone. Get used to what their truths feel like and see if they'll be cooperative or not. It's just a standard question like, how are you today? Or, what is your name?
Stop dragging it out.
Tsukauchi raised a hand in a placating gesture, though the hint of a smirk played across his lips.
Sorry.
His expression fell into something more serious.
I asked Suzuki her name. She lied.
She lied?
Shouta shot a glance at Hizashi, who looked just as baffled as he felt.
Yes. She said that her name was Suzuki-era, but my quirk registered that as a lie. Maybe your quirk was wrong?
Offered Hizashi weakly, but Tsukauchi just shook his head.
I'm far more likely to get a false positive than a false negative. And the few times I've had something come up as a lie incorrectly, it was never for a question that simple. She was lying.
So her name isn't Suzuki-era?
Evidently, no. Now,
Tsukauchi continued briskly.
That on its own wouldn't be concerning to me. Could just be an identity crisis of some kind. Something for a therapist to handle, not me. But the rest of her behavior is just concerning.
The USJ,
muttered Shouta, jaw clenching at the memory.
I can't believe she did that.
Tsukauchi nodded.
Right. That is not the kind of behavior you'd expect from a first year in high school. Plus, there's the way she handled everything after you fell unconscious.
Shota's eyes narrowed.
Oh, and how was that?
Well, based on the accounts from the other students, she took charge of the situation very handily. It was actually quite impressive. And if circumstances were different, I'd say the kid deserves a medal.
But circumstances as they are.
The kid gave you a field blood transfusion, Aizawa. Shouta sucked in a breath between his teeth, letting his eyes fall shut.
No one stopped her?
I don't think anyone thought they should. The only other person with any medical experience was Yaoyoro Zumomo, and she claimed that she only had a passing knowledge. Said that she assumed Suzuki knew better. That could have been bad.
Hizashi glanced at Shouta with concern.
That could have been really bad. She's lucky it turned out okay.
Tsukauchi shook his head, flipping through his notebook again almost absent-mindedly.
No, see, that's the thing. I don't think it was luck. According to the others, she defended herself by saying she's a universal donor.
Even if she's O-negative, there was still a chance.
She's not O-negative. She's Rh null. No antigens. So she's a true universal donor. Do you know how rare that is? I do, because I looked it up. There are only 63 people in the world with that blood type. Well, 64 now, I guess. Do you know what blood type is on her records?
Let me guess. Not Rh null.
A positive.
Why would that...
I don't know!
Tsukauchi threw his hands up in the air, bringing them down again to rub at his temples once more.
I honestly have no clue why. I get that records aren't perfect, but to have that kind of mix-up just doesn't make sense. She's lucky she didn't actually need a blood transfusion, because she would have died.
Shouta looked up sharply.
She didn't need a blood transfusion?
No. The doctor said she recovered before they could set it up.
That doesn't make sense.
Yeah, really? It doesn't make sense? Tsukauchi dragged his hands across his face. I'm glad you've joined the party.
No, really. That doesn't make sense. I know she was losing blood before I fell unconscious. And if she really decided to give me a transfusion, there's no way she could have recovered on her own. There was a wound on her shoulder, and it was still bleeding heavily when she got to the USJ. Not to mention when that bird villain slammed into her. She must have at least broken a couple of bones.
It was Tsukauchi's turn to shoot Shouta a sharp look. Suzuki didn't have any injuries when she was admitted. They assumed the blood loss must have been because of her impromptu transfusion, and that she just hadn't managed to get it to work efficiently. The three men stared at each other in a still sort of silence, Hizashi breaking it to drum his finger across his chair nervously.
That doesn't make any sense. Well, I'm glad we can all agree on that, said Tsukauchi exasperatedly. In fact, that's pretty much the only thing I can say for certain about Suzuki Era. She doesn't make any goddamn sense.
She's Sparrow, muttered Shouta darkly.
You seem certain. Tsukauchi flipped through his notebook again, coming to a halt at what appeared to be his interview notes with Suzuki.
I am. I've had my suspicions, but this just confirmed it. She has to be.
There's more than one person in the world with a regeneration quirk, Eraser.
Who also happened to be a 14-year-old girl with an interest in heroics.
Yeah, that does narrow the field a little bit. Tsukauchi jotted something down, nose wrinkling. I feel like this just raises more questions than it answers, though. She claims her parents are in America.
Are they?
I don't know. I got that information from a doctor. She refuses to talk to me. Has a nervous breakdown every time I try to mention the USJ to her.
Think she knows your quirk?
She didn't at the beginning of our interview, but she's smart, I guess, said Tsukauchi wearily. What do you want to do about this, Eraser? Because honestly, there isn't enough evidence to bring her in. We could pin her with interfering with an investigation and then try to build up that, but I doubt anything would stick. No judge is going to give us a warrant for a 14-year-old who wouldn't answer some questions about a traumatizing event.
I think bringing her in would be a mistake,
confirmed Shouta.
Even if we could arrest her for violating vigilante law, there are too many unknowns. We could be messing with a delicate situation.
If that kid is actually Sparrow...
She is,
muttered Shouta. If she is, continued Tsukauchi resolutely, then she is the cheekiest kid I've ever seen. Why would she think coming to the UA was a good idea? Maybe she wants to be a hero? Offered Hizashi softly. She's a good kid. Quiet and struggling a little in class, but good. Good or no, she's breaking the law. And she decided the best place for her was to be in a school staffed almost entirely by pro-heroes?
Doesn't make sense,
said Shouta warily. Doesn't make sense, echoed Tsukauchi with a sigh, standing up and shrugging his coat back on. I'll keep in touch. She's still here, so I doubt she can get into too much trouble. Could you two try to keep an eye on her? Seems like she's suspicious enough of me as it is. Of course, Hizashi grinned back at Shouta. In fact, Sho should definitely stay admitted for at least as long as she is, otherwise we wouldn't have an excuse to keep an eye on her. Hizashi grinned back at Shouta,
grumbling something that sounded suspiciously like, not my case.
Shouta gave a nod to the leaving Tsukauchi and sank back into the bed.
Fine, but only to make sure she doesn't get struck by lightning or something.
Great, I'll leave you to it then. Let me know when you get out. Tsukuichi returned Hizashi's wave and left the room, closing the door behind him.
You know, she'll probably be out of here before whatever arbitrary time frame you've decided for me.
Well,
Said Hizashi brightly.
then at least I can make sure you're here till then. Besides, if her parents really are out of the country, it'll take some doing to go through the proper procedures for a release.
I guess.
Shouta wasn't convinced. The girl had talked her way into an underground gambling den, and then proceeded to hustle known criminals out of a significant amount of money. Not to mention the several times she'd managed to evade him over the rooftops. If anyone could weasel her way out of a hospital visit, it was Sparrow. Sparrow. Suzuki. Shit. He should have gone with his gut the first time the thought had struck him. Immediately taken it to Tsukuuchi and begun to pull her records. At least then they'd have something to work with, rather than stumbling around in the dark. The only thing he knew for certain was that this was no ordinary vigilante case. Not simply a disaffected teen who was getting her kicks by beating up muggers in alleyways. Grimly, Shouta recalled her actions during the USJ. How she talked a villain into targeting her instead. Knowing her quirk, the decision did seem slightly less... No, she was still a child. Every time he'd seen her quirk in action, it had been accompanied by blood and pain, a bullet leaving her twitching against a wall, or the rush of Nomu making her stumble to her feet with a wince. A child didn't deserve to suffer like that. Shouldn't think it necessary. And yet Sparrow, Suzuki era, threw herself into danger again and again as if it were nothing, jumping off of buildings and in front of bullets and
between himself and a psychotic villain.
What you thinking about, Sho?
Hizashi leaned against the bed, head propping up in his hands.
Just Sparrow, Suzuki, whatever.
Concerned?
Very. The kid has a daredevil streak a mile wide, and such a complete lack of common sense that it puts my class to shame.
Aw, you do care.
Still, continued Shouta without pause, she's somehow managed to elude the police for several months, as well as walk through UA without arousing any suspicion for, well, just a week. But if the USJ incident hadn't happened...
Then who knows how long she could have lasted. Just a bunch of contradictions, isn't she?
She's an idiot, but she's a capable idiot. I don't know what's more infuriating. Knowing that whatever course of action she takes next will be ridiculous and self-destructive, or knowing that there's nothing I can do to stop it.
Hizashi laughed, leaning back in his chair and glancing over at Shouta with a fond grin.
Well, I wonder what that's like.
End of chapter 21.